guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I have Liz Ilgenfritz here, who is a friend of mine. We actually met 13 years ago at a yoga training with Yoga Shanti. And over the years, we've kind of ran into each other randomly, but in the last, I don't know, probably 8 months, I've seen you a few times, and we were like, wow, we need to sit down and talk and kind of catch up. And Liz has become all things expert on pelvic floor. She is a pelvic empowerment coach. She is a 500-hour yoga certified instructor. She is a pelvic floor and holistic sexuality educator, an embodiment coach, and feminine wisdom guide. She is the founder of Space and Ritual and is here today to discuss with us all things pelvic floor. What is it? Why is it important? How do we address it? Etc. I think this is a topic that is a bit taboo. It's something that we don't see talked about that much. We don't talk about with our doctors that much. And as we were preparing for this conversation, I was saying to Liz how my OB, after I had my child, or even while I was pregnant, didn't discuss with me at all my pelvic floor. And obviously, I have an understanding of how I should have cared for my pelvic floor before, during, and after my pregnancy, but that was on my own, with my own agency, that I had to address that. So I'm super excited to have you and to have you share all of your expert wisdom with us today. So to kick things off, what is your pelvic floor?
Okay, great question. And actually, even before I answer that, I would love to tap into what you just said about your experience with your doctor and having a baby. I have 4 kids, and if I tell you, not once in all of those births had the pelvic floor ever come up, which is surprising. Like, this all for me has happened after my children. Yeah. And I remember thinking, like, how is that baby coming out and what is going on? Like, I didn't know. Yeah. I didn't know. So let me answer your question with that in mind. The pelvic floor is anatomically the set of muscles that has 3 layers and connects it to support your organs within your pelvic bowl. It actually helps hold the pelvis together, and it has from an energetic standpoint, a symbiotic relationship with your breath. Right. And it reflects the state of your nervous system. Super, super important. Physiologically, also, obviously, the breath is related physiologically to it, but also, emotionally, and the state of your nervous system, again, is very much related to your pelvic floor. And that's an awareness that you have to learn. Like, we are not taught that anywhere else. Yeah. And then mentally, I like to think about how we relate to our bodies in layers. The physical, the energetic, and the mental. And so mentally, as you said, taboo, what's going on down there. We have a lot of stories and a lot of ideas about our pelvises, and so that has an imprint on the other parts, how we feel, how we breathe, and how we hold our bodies. So there's 3 layers to really what is going on in the pelvic floor, but starting with the anatomical thing.
Great. Okay, that's very helpful. So how does, I'm a Pilates instructor, you teach yoga, we talk a lot about the core and these things. How does the pelvic floor relate directly to the core?
Okay, so let's just talk about, again, physically, it shares attachments. Right. The pelvic floor is a set of muscles that connects on the inner bowl of your pelvis at the bottom portion, and then your abdominals attach at the top portion of your pelvis, and they attach between your pelvis and your rib cage and your spine. So they have to work together, right? And the most important thing that, I want to say just super directly that there is a relationship when you turn on your pelvic floor and you lift and contract your pelvic floor, you turn on the deepest muscles of the body, which is the transverse abdominis. And so if you're not engaging in relating to your pelvic floor when you're trying to work your abdominals, you are missing out. Right. You're not giving it a floor. And quite frankly, the transverse abdominals, the work of them is to reduce the pressure in the abdominal cavity. So you'll push in and down. So when you're trying to evacuate things from your body, you're using the transverse abdominals, and you don't want to go down when you're working abdominals. You want to go in and up. Yes. And so without a relationship to understand how to do that, and I have yet to meet a person who has not done this work who understands that, you are probably pushing down, and you might be causing yourself pelvic floor issues.
Right. And can you talk about pelvic floor issues? What does that mean? Like, how would we know that it's causing us a problem?
Yeah. So again, I'll start by talking about the physical, because there's the other nervous system components that are big red flags for me that there's something going on in the pelvic floor. But physically, you may feel like you have to pee a lot. You may feel like you can't hold in your pee. You may have pelvic pain. There's also times in your life, like motherhood. Obviously, there's a lot of changes in the pelvic floor. There's a spreading, and then there has to be a containing. And menopause is a time with a lot of shifts, and a lot of hormonal shifts can change things in there. So those are times where, like, just life transitions, we know that there's changes going on. But in terms of like symptoms and presentations of like this is like something is coming up to call for your attention, I would say those things. The urinary issues a lot of times, pain. And then there are other things can happen, like there's a condition called vaginismus, for example, where there's like a continual contraction of the pelvic floor where you literally can't get anything inside the vagina. And you'd be surprised, people who have this condition, they don't understand that they have this condition. Wow. They might just be like, well, I can't get a tampon in. And because they live in their bodies all the time, it feels like, oh, is this not okay? Like, or they've just grown so accustomed to living with it that they don't understand that that's something that they can reharmonize, they can balance in their bodies, because that's not a condition that you want to stay with.
Right. Got it. Okay, so the pelvic floor, it can be weak. We can have this bearing down, but it can also be too tight.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the too weak of a pelvic floor, but also too tight of a pelvic floor?
Yes. So if you so I like to, this is a beautiful metaphor, and I learned this from the person that I learned about yoga for the pelvis from, which is, think about your pelvic floor like any other muscle, like the muscles of your hands. A hand has to be able to open and close to be functional.
Right.
Either one. If your hand's like this, you can't use it, right? If your hand's like this, you can't like do anything with it.
Right.
You have to be able to do that. And so the muscles of the pelvic floor are the same way. So you want to be able to allow them to relax.
Right.
And you need to be able to contract them and lift them.
Right.
It's not just a squeeze, it's a contract and lift.
Right.
But you have to be able to release and relax them. And I would say that most women need to learn the relaxation and the letting go and the lengthening and the spreading. Because there's a lot of reasons that in our lives we don't do that. We feel like we got to keep it together, and it shows up there.
Interesting. Yeah, I have always kind of thought about the pelvic floor as you want to be able to bob and weave with you, like as like life, like catch it. But also we want, correct me if I'm wrong, I've also thought like you don't want to have to think about your pelvic floor, like, or is that, am I is it the kind of thing that you want to be thoughtful of, or are you supposed to like it's like a trusty, like it knows, like, is that the goal? Like it knows what to do when you're like jumping or running for the bus, or?
I think that both of those things are true, right? Like you want it to be there for you and work with you, with your breath, with your life as it needs to be. And then there are times that you want to be in connection with it. I mean, because also from an energy perspective, from the pelvic floor, that is the center of, the first chakra in yoga, our safety, our foundation, our stability, and that is deeply related to the pelvic floor. We have to feel like we are held in our bodies, and that's very important. And then also in the second chakra, similar, it's also related to the pelvic floor, which is more around the sacral area, a little higher, a little deeper in the pelvis. That's where creativity and sensuality is. And that space needs energy, and it needs life, and it needs breath. And when you're in connection with it, and when you feel like lit up and you're like, I'm safe and I'm fluid and I'm flowing and I'm like feeling juicy, like that whole area should feel alive.
Right. Okay.
So connection,
totally. Okay, yes. Okay, that makes total sense. So we've talked about the breath and the abdominals. And how does that relate to our posture, just kind of putting our whole body together?
So posture is obviously really important. I would say the way to talk about that is really to talk about at the same time the breath. And this is something that you and I learned a lot about through yoga. Posture affects breath, affects the energy body. And those three things work together. So if you're having a posture like this a lot of time, which a lot of us do, especially because we're texting all the time, you're having this sort of like very, what's what I'm looking for? You know, soft and not awake front body and this very like wide back body, and it's not balanced, because what you want with the pelvic floor is you want balance, because this posture does something. It tightens the back of your pelvic floor, and this posture tightens the front of your pelvic floor, and you don't want either of them tight. You want them balanced. You want, like, this is probably very Pilates way of thinking about it. You want your perineum, which is the center and the keystone of your pelvic floor. Should we talk about anatomy?
Yeah.
The space between your vagina and your anus. You want that right above the very center of your diaphragm. I love the way you're moving as I'm talking about it.
I'm thinking about it.
Right? And right above the crown of your head, and then you can like even feel inside your mouth. A little dome inside your mouth, and you want that lined up. So you want these like deep domes of your body aligned. So I don't want people to think about straighten your back, sit up straight, and then you become rigid.
Right.
You want these like domes. Like, you ever seen those beautiful chimes where they're like these like brass or I think usually brass domes that make this beautiful chimes.
Oh, I have one right there.
Oh my gosh, you have it?
Yeah.
Should we grab it? Yeah. It's funny. Yeah, beautiful. So you want them like, this could be your pelvic floor, and this is your diaphragm, and this is the roof of your mouth or the crown of your head.
Yeah.
And you want them lined up so you get this beautiful humming sound, because there's a little tangle in here.
Yeah.
So that's kind of perfect, right? You don't want tangles. It makes a weird noise.
All right, okay, that's a sign. Oh, wow. It's convenient I had that. Clearly this was a conversation meant to be.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, obviously in Pilates we talk about the balance of strength but also mobility, right? Like if you are too rigid, it's like you're not a tin soldier. But if you're too soft, then you have you're not stable. So finding like it's always this balance of effort and ease, or that but definitely being aware of your posture, but not being too one or the other. No, it's so true. It's so beautifully said. And we can talk about those things with our hip joint and our shoulder girdle and all that stuff. But it's like very hard to talk about that about our pelvic floor. And in fact, it's the core. I'll also say this, like, if you've done a fair amount of yoga practice or Pilates, like, you have to think about, this is the center of your body. Everything you're doing in your lower body and everything you're doing from your upper body, you'd be cutting yourself off if you don't have this as an open channel. Right. So I had a C-section. So I think for those who sometimes people think, oh, I had a C-section, I don't need to do anything for my pelvic floor. I knew that wasn't the case, because there's still this big bearing down. You're still carried for 10 months, all this water and all this weight, but your pelvic floor is definitely affected. And when your abdominals are cut for the C-section, there's also this like,
it's a shifting
around.
Yes,
that has to like realign.
For sure.
And I just like, that's a mindset that like we need to just
totally. And even just to think the simplicity of, our uterus is connected to our sacrum. It's sort of anchored in our sacrum. And then there's a lot of attachments to the pelvic floor that are also anchored there as well. So they're sharing attachments with this place in our body where you're growing a human being.
Right. Yes.
And then the human being is birthed, and everything is coming back together, and it's all there, and it's all held together in this bowl with the floor.
Got it. Very important. I'm loving this conversation. I think it's like so good to talk about, and the more we talk about it, the more it's like, it's good. So what would be some signs that we should address our pelvic floor?
I would say that for sure, if you're having any kind of pelvic pain, and also even like your low back and your hips. So I like to think about the periphery of the pelvis as well, because if we're having pain in our hips and any of the attachments that are shared, you want to be considering what's going on in the pelvic floor as well. Okay. Secondly, obviously, if you're having, like I was saying before, any urinary issues, feeling like you have to pee all the time, not feeling like you can evacuate fully.
Because constipation can be a sign of too tight of a pelvic floor.
Yeah,
right?
oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that too, because I really was talking about peeing, but I didn't talk about the other part. That's really important. No, it's totally true. And then, but if you also feel like if you're doing jumping jacks or you're on a trampoline or you're running and you're leaking. That's very normalized also in our culture. Like, oh, ha, ha, ha.
Oh, you're at a baby.
Yeah, but it's really not, it really doesn't need to be the case.
Right.
And so there's that. And then what did we just talk about? Oh yeah. And so having digestive issues. And it's one of those like chicken and the egg things. It's hard to know whether do you become constipated if you have a tight pelvic floor. Because when you're, I'll say this, when you're peeing and when you're pooping, this is so important. and a lot of people, again, don't understand this because we're never taught. That is a relaxation exercise.
Right.
You should be thinking about relaxing your pelvic floor, not bearing down. Like you're bearing down with your muscles. Like that's going to happen naturally. Like we've been doing that our whole lives. But the pelvic floor has to relax and release.
Yes.
So, okay, so if your pelvic floor is tight and it can't do that, you might find yourself forcing and pushing. Also, just if you have general digestive issues unrelated to the pelvic floor, a lot of bearing down and a lot of pushing can cause other related issues. So it could be the cause or the result of.
Right. Okay, that's really good to know.
And either way, the solution is kind of the same.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so many of us are over 40, and I know you said hormonally it can definitely you can start to feel changes in like the strength of your pelvic floor or the tightness.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of like happens as you age.
Happens.
Prolapse.
Yeah. Oh, well, prolapse. Yeah. I mean, we didn't talk about that as a more extreme version, but
can you explain what prolapse is just for those who don't know?
So prolapse is the organs of your pelvis can descend, and so they can descend in different stages. Stage 1 is very minor, all the way to stage where like literally your organs could come out of your vagina. And it's it's very problematic. We won't address any severe issues here, but we want our organs to be held buoyantly and healthily inside the bowl of the pelvis.
Place.
In the right place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's say we have a weak pelvic floor. Can you give some examples of ways we can address that?
Yes, and so I love the fact that you use the word weak because it's such a great word. And again, remember, weak means either one. It can either be too loose or too tight because either one is weak because it's not usable.
Right.
So number one is determine what is going on in your own pelvic floor because no one's really going to fully know except you.
Right.
So I always work with women in 3 sort of phases. Number 1 is knowledge, like understand what's going on in your body.
Yeah.
Understand what happens anatomically and physiologically in your pelvis. Number 2, discovery. Discover what's actually happening in your own pelvis. Not what you should, not how it's supposed to, but what's really going on. And that's things like looking. Like if you want to practice pelvic floor exercises, I want women to like use a mirror at home and look and see, okay, if I'm trying to do this thing where I'm engaging in lifting, am I actually pushing down? Like you can see it yourself with a mirror, for example. But and there are ways to find out on your own if you have tension, too much tension or too much laxity in your pelvis. And so I guide women to understand, to explore that in their bodies. Do I have too much tension or do I have too much laxity? And then once you've discovered these things about yourself, you can bring yourself into harmony. Step 3, you can embody the work of bringing yourself back into balance.
Got it. Okay. Amazing. Okay, that's great. So could you give an example of if you have too much laxity, what an exercise would be?
Yes. So I would say, first of all, what we want to do is make sure that we are having access to doing a deep pelvic breath. Like, are we actually able to bring the breath down there? Because in either case, whether you have too much tension or too much laxity, you may be like avoiding that area and energetically not sending anything down there. And we need to have access and energy to come down to the pelvic floor. So I'm always working with women to bring energy down into the pelvis. So I have mudras, we work on breath so that we're sure that like, okay, are you there? Are you able to connect? I'll use tactile, modalities to help women really connect with the pelvic floor. Like, okay, so it's, you're trying to do that. Okay, do you feel that? Really make that biofeedback loop for them. And then, I would say generally speaking, it's learning to engage. So there's so many different ways to learn to engage. I move women into a lot of different postures and positions. Let's try it on your back. Let's try it on all fours. Let's try it upside down. Let's try it laying
on your
down.
side. Oh, yeah.
Because everybody is different.
Right.
But so it's a lot of work in learning to engage, learning to stand and sit better, learning to, all day long we're sitting, right? And sitting badly is a number one no with the pelvic floor because it will. We sit all the time, and so we want to sit in a balanced way. So sitting and standing, I help women with yoga postures. So helping that, when you're in downward facing dog or you're in standing postures, learning to engage the pelvic floor from the feet through the legs, through the center and up. Very, very important. And I have seen, you can just see a woman completely change versus just standing there and sort of sinking in their bodies. To teach them how to draw from the ground up through their pelvis is a game changer. And it also makes that energetic shift. You can see how we feel a little unsteady and a little and then this is why I call it pelvic empowerment. You're empowered, you're really in your body.
Yes. Okay, that's all very helpful and good to think about. So, coming out of this conversation, what are the top 3 things you'd want the listener to really own with their pelvic floor?
Know your own pelvic floor. This 3-phase model that I work with. Get knowledge, understand what's happening in your body and how your body works. I'm so always shocked about how many women don't understand how our bodies work. Very important. And then discovery, get to know what's going on in your own body. Get a mirror, breathe, feel whether you have tension or not. And then 3, embodiment, doing the practices that are right for you. And I want to be really clear because you asked me a few different questions and I gave you some pretty lengthy answers about these things because it's quite a complex topic. But a practice for a woman who has too much tension versus a practice for a woman who has too much laxity in her pelvic floor are very different.
Right.
Foundationally, I'm always going to work with a woman on her breath. And her posture and understanding, making that connection between the mind and the body and that being okay with what we have and how we are. But the practices to come to harmony are completely different. And so I can't say this enough. It's rarely go and do your Kegels. Absolutely not. Because if there's a woman who has a pelvic floor that's too tight, I am absolutely not going to sit here and have her work on engaging her pelvic floor. It's going to make it worse. It's actually what happened to me. We didn't talk about my story, but that's what happened to me. And that's how I came into this work.
Oh, yeah. I meant to ask you that. Oh, that's interesting. So you found your pelvic floor was too tight?
Yeah, I had 4 kids and didn't know anything about it. Had difficult births every time, right? And only after my 4th baby, which was a very traumatic birth, and almost instantly after became single, we had a divorce, I was like, oh, I better find out what's going on my pelvic floor now that I'm single and I have all these babies. And then I started, and my doctor was like, oh yeah, let's go to pelvic floor physical therapy. You've had 4 babies. I was like, okay. And I go and they just put me on these machines and tell me to tighten up and da-da-da. And I'm like, now I'm feeling terrible. I didn't feel bad. Now I feel terrible. And I just discovered through all of my own discovery that my pelvic floor was too tight. I went to a physical therapist who made it worse. It was crazy.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it happens a lot, unfortunately. But there are a lot of good physical therapists out there. I want to be really clear, and I'm always happy to recommend some.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, that was very upsetting.
It is really upsetting. Because, in general, you only ever hear, in my first education with the pelvic floor and Pilates and talking about postnatal care, there was only ever talk about retightening Kegels. And that's it. And it was only in probably the last couple 3 or 4 years that I was was it was made aware to me, and I started hearing and reading about pelvic floors that are too tight.
I'm glad that you have come across that without talking to me about it. You came to this on your own, because it's still not talked about very much. I just read an article in Vogue that came out yesterday that was not talking about it, that was talking about the tightening. And I just was like so frustrated about it, because I would say it's a combination of a couple of things. Number one, I think the reason that we talk all about, tightening your pelvic floor and Kegel, part of it is this pathologizing and this hypersexualizing women in the sort of that kind of cultural piece. And then there's also, I think we probably do have tighter pelvic floors than we ever have before, because it comes from stress. And I see women who are stress breathers. I mean, you probably see this with your clients too. And they're
breathing up in here.
Yeah, and reverse breathing. They're breathing up and exhaling down.
Right. Yes.
And so I'll actually say that's my second takeaway is begin to try to understand the direction of your breath. Because the inhale moves in and down, and it's like a massage for the pelvis. And the exhale lifts up. And I would say most women who come to my workshops, I will do a poll, and it will be the opposite. So we're mostly reverse breathers, and that causes pelvic floor condition. And so stressful lifestyles, the constant stress of our phone, and it's all up here. We're just the cutting off from this part of our body down is causing probably more tight pelvic floors than ever.
Got it. Okay. So I guess if we feel like if all of people are listening and watching this, and they're like, "Wow, this sounds like me." We find you, obviously, so where can we find you?
Oh, great. Spaceandritual.com.
Okay.
You'll see on my website, there's going to be two options. There's the one-on-one container with me, where I'll work with women for I have a 12-week program that I say, I teach women in 12 weeks, but it took me 12 years. It's funny because you mentioned the 12 years, but it took me 12 years to learn.
Yeah. How old was your youngest then?
It was like a year after. I mean, I was right in it. I had just had him.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I hadn't yet seen the pelvic floor person. I was still married at the time.
Got it. Okay.
It was in that little window. So that was 13 years ago.
Yes.
And so it was the year after. So 12 years it took me to learn this information that I'm sharing with women now. And I say 12 years, I mean 12 years of dedicated practice and study.
Researching.
And doing it in my own body.
Yes.
And because no one gave this to me. It was a series of things. I had to go to a lot of different places to gain this knowledge. So I work one-on-one with women, 12 weeks. You can learn what I did in 12 years. And also my workshops and retreats. Because I do 3.5-hour workshops where we can really go deep. And they're usually pretty small. I like to keep them in a small container, 8 women. So it's very intimate. And then also we're in sisterhood. Because when we're in sisterhood and we realize we're not alone, there are a lot of other women that don't understand their bodies and are interested in coming more into their own power. It's magic.
Yeah,
actually.
And it's a safe place. And I think when you're treading new territory in your own body, it's really important to feel safe.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, why would you start if you didn't feel safe?
Well, I love that you say that, because that's really, we kind of started the conversation by saying that. I mean, there's a reason that we have so much tension in our bodies, and that there are a lot more people with tight pelvic floors now. We have every reason to armor our bodies and our pelvises in this world today, and never more so than in this very moment. Except maybe many, 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 many years ago, we used to cage our pelvises, but not since then. And so it's a big ask to find a way to feel safe enough to de-armor and open, because we know it's good for us.
Yes. And now, I think I know the answer to this, but it's never too late to start, right? Whether you're 22 or 30 or 50 or 70, at all of those points.
I've worked with women in all those ages, absolutely.
Just because you're a certain age or you have or have not had a baby.
Yes.
Babies aren't indicative at all, right, of pelvic floor issues. And I think at least kind of what I have gathered is women and people in general associate, if you haven't had a baby, you probably don't have pelvic floor issues. So
true.
Any woman of any age, it's never too late, or that could be you.
Yeah. 100%. 100%.
And today we really just spoke about women, but just want to briefly touch, men can have pelvic floor issues.
Oh yeah,
big
and I
time.
just saw a place that opened up that focuses just on men, which I don't know it yet, and I don't know him, but I was like, oh, that's really nice. I used to work with both genders.
Yes.
Well, those two, I used to work with all genders, I'll say, but I decided to focus on women because just it's a personal preference. Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, just wanna,
you had mentioned earlier about cycling, like
Yeah.
a lot of cyclists, male cyclists can have that, and just a lot of reasons. Prostate issues,
Yes, yeah.
pain, surgery.
Yeah. I remember actually, did you ever do FAMI at Mount Sinai? Do you know what that is? It's functional anatomy movement, and I'm blanking at the moment what the I stands for, but you work with prosections. So like, the brain, the pelvic, I've touched the pelvic floor, I've looked at the pelvic floor.
Pretty cool.
And they showed us, different versions of prolapse, and they showed one of a man who it was crazy, the prolapse that was like into his testicles,
Oh,
it was
really?
like a really extreme. So I know that we're talking about women today, but just wanted to touch for a moment, because I think it's also, if you're listening to this, if you have a partner or a family member, it's good to know who you can share so to help direct them.
Yeah, well, and if I can say one other thing.
Yeah, sure.
Erectile dysfunction. We have a lot of erectile dysfunction in this world, and we don't talk about the connection between the pelvic floor and that. Maybe some people do. I haven't really heard it. I'm pretty sure there's a pretty close relationship there.
That sounds like it makes total sense. All right. Well, Liz, thank you so much. You've shared so much information. So we can find you at spaceandritual.com. I will link Liz's website in the comments in the description of the story, so you can check it out. And thank you so much for sharing this information. It's a pleasure to have you. I learned a lot.
Thanks for listening.
And I'm so excited to get this conversation started and shared. Thank you.
Thank
you
you
guys for listening.